everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. So this is our final Human Rights in Practice event of the semester and the academic year. I know there are quite a few familiar faces from events over the course of the past year, so good to see you all. And we're excited to be closing out with this really important and timely issue. And also very happy to welcome our speaker, Sarah Sadoun, who we've been working with since, I think, last fall to find a date that works, given her very extensive travel for her work with Human Rights Watch. So as always, our event is organized by the International Human Rights Clinic, as well as the Center for International and Comparative Law. And we also have a number of co-sponsors, including the American Constitution Society, the Business Law Society, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Human Rights Law Society, the International Law Society, and the National Lawyers Guild. So I'll start with a brief introduction of Sarah, who is a senior researcher working on poverty and inequality at Human Rights Watch. She investigates the multi-layered impact of economic policy reforms, poor governance, and moneyed interests on economic and social rights, including social protection, health, education, and clean water. Sarah's work has focused on a number of different issues, including the International Monetary Fund's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the human rights impact of the US government's deregulation of mountaintop removal coal mining, as well as the disposal of coal ash, a toxic byproduct of combusting coal. And she's also researched and written extensively on how corruption in resource-rich countries robs people of their fundamental rights, with a particular focus on Equatorial Guinea. And with that, I'm excited to start our conversation. And today we're going to do more of a Q&A. So I'll ask Sarah a number of questions, and then we'll open it up at the end for any questions and reflections from all of you. So we'll look forward to that engagement at the end. So starting with our first question, which is if you could begin, Sarah, with some introductory comments on both definitions and framings of international human rights, in particular discussing first two categories of human rights, so civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, and then also two specific rights that are relevant in this context, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, as well as the right to development.
Sure. First, I want to thank you for inviting me here, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And especially a pleasure to talk, at an event titled "The Human Rights Economy." Look, we're at a difficult moment for human rights, both in terms of people's experience of their rights, and also in terms of the resonance of the human rights framework as something that makes people's lives better. And it's striking to me that at this moment, the idea of a human rights economy is actually gaining steam, which I think both offers hope and also a kind of path forward for the human rights movement. But before we get into the human rights economy, I want to respond to your question because I think it's important to lay out a very basic framework of human rights, because especially in the United States, a lot of people associate human rights with civil and political rights, things like non-discrimination, right to protest, fair trials, things like that, which is of course, very important, but only half the human rights framework. The other half is economic, social, and cultural rights, things like the right to health, the right to education, the right to housing, water, social security, not in the US sense of our social security program, but in terms of income support through different life stages. And I think when you bring in economic, social, and cultural rights into the human rights framework, you do more than bring in like a set of neglected rights. You actually, a new paradigm emerges. Whereas I think the focus on civil and political rights, at times, not always, but often, was seen as a very kind of intervening at particular moments to protect particular people's rights from specific abuses. And when we bring in economic, social, and cultural rights, what emerges is actually a structural roadmap for a society in which all people can thrive. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is essentially an agreement between governments on how to distribute resources. It creates obligations for governments, both individually and through international assistance and cooperation, which is really, really key, to use the maximum available resources for the realization of the enumerated rights, which includes what I mentioned before: health, education, social security, water, housing, food, things like that. So that's the kind of basis. And then I wanted to touch on the two specific rights you mentioned. Of course, there are many developments in the human rights framework over the past few decades, but there are two that have like direct bearing on the human rights economy. One is in 2022, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution on the right to recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Obviously, this was a less salient issue when the human rights framework was first being set out, but extremely important for human rights and also a kind of pillar of the human rights economy. And the second one is the right to development, which is established through a declaration in 1986 and was really initiated by Global South governments. And I think that the right to development has three elements that are important for the human rights economy. First, it was an effort to really re-emphasize the way in which human rights is expected to address structural barriers to economic, social, and cultural rights. And so to kind of really bring out that structural element of the human rights framework. The second is it emphasizes both the individual and the collective aspect of rights, which I think has kind of gotten lost or not been adequately emphasized in our current understanding of the human rights framework. And the third is a conception of development that centers human rights. So if we, if a government has a development strategy that's, based on, say, we're going to develop our export industry by allowing companies to pay starvation wages and horrific working conditions and to dump toxic pollution into the waterways, pay basically no taxes or very little taxes, while like a small number of people get rich, but the GDP grows, like that's not a development strategy that comports with the right to development. And that becomes really important in the development of the idea of a human rights economy.
So that leads perfectly to the second question, which is talking through and defining what we mean by a human rights economy, both at the domestic level and in the international context.
So, I mean, the idea of the human rights economy is very simple in its basis, right? It's the idea that all economic decisions should put people and planet at the center. But obviously very complicated in its execution and very far-reaching in its implications. So it essentially establishes guideposts against which economic decisions should be made. On the domestic level, that means, for example, the budget allocation for sectors that are really important to rights. So looking at how much is the government spending, for example, on education or on health. But when you start to look at questions of budget allocation, it gets you to questions of revenues, right? It might be that the government is underspending on education or health because they don't have the revenue to support higher spending. And then you start to look at fiscal policies, both in terms of is there adequate revenue, and also how are those revenues being raised? Is it being done progressively, or is it being done regressively through, for example, consumption taxes, which tend to put a higher burden on people with lower incomes? And so all of that, on the domestic level within a government's control is part of the human rights economy. But it also recognizes that governments are operating within a global economic system that often constrains them. And so, for example, back to revenue, it is very difficult for governments to raise more revenues progressively because multinational corporations operating within their jurisdictions could very easily shift profits to tax havens, and it's very difficult for them to capture those revenues. So the kind of recognizing that broader framework in which governments are operating, it calls for like transforming international financial architecture to align it with human rights, and that relates to tax, that relates to debt, that relates to that international financial institutions like the IMF, which I do a lot of work on, the World Bank, and others. Yeah, I mean, I'll stop there. I wanted to say a word also on like where the idea comes from. I'm not sure if I should do that now. So, I mean, the idea for the human rights economy has been developing over many years, and by a lot of human rights academics, as well as NGOs focused more on economic social rights, like the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And then in recent years, it has been picked up and really championed by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, both in terms of developing the concept, but also in practice, like actually assessing budgets against human rights standards. And it comes at a time when a lot of different movements are kind of birthing ideas of transformational economic approaches, kind of emphasizing the movement from which it emerges, right? So, for example, climate justice on a just transition, or decolonial movements, tax and debt justice movements, focusing on economists focusing on inequality. You have the care economy, right? That coming from feminist economic circles. So there's a lot of kind of different ideas for how do you transform our economic systems so that they deliver better for people and enable a sustainable environment. And so I want to make it clear that the human rights economy, this concept, doesn't compete with these ideas. In fact, it actually draws from them. And what I think it offers is a legal and norm-setting framework to absorb these ideas. Right? There's the human rights is the only one of these that actually come with a set of legal obligations that are agreed to by governments from all over the world, and then a whole system of treaty bodies, special rapporteurs, etc., that is truly global in its scope for developing what those norms are. So if you take, for example, the idea of tax justice, what makes a particular tax policy just? I mean, part of it is intuitive, like the fact that Warren Buffett is paying a lower tax bracket than his secretary. We can kind of viscerally say, like, that's not okay. But what are you measuring tax justice against? And so what the human rights framework offers is actually a kind of rigor and internationally credible system for producing those kinds of benchmarks. And now, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights released a statement on tax and human rights just a few weeks ago, really setting that out. So I think that that's like a kind of contribution that the human rights framework makes to this kind of set of ideas emerging from other movements.
And then next, if you could talk about some of the impacts of the current geopolitical context, both in this country and globally, on the human rights space, and maybe also starting with what some examples of those changes in the geopolitical context, and then secondly, what those impacts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is for me really the interesting piece of the human rights economy, because it comes at a time of obviously very fraught geopolitical context. I imagine a lot of people are quite focused on the rapid political changes in the United States, but for several years now, governments around the world have been facing what's often referred to as a polycrisis, where you have this kind of extreme intensification of intersecting pressures on governments. So you have an increase in the amount of debt servicing that many governments have. You have exactly at a time when you have a cost of living crisis, so people are much more in need of public support, and yet governments are being forced to actually cut public spending. Dozens of governments under IMF-mandated austerity like I mentioned, extreme difficulty raising revenues because of a tax system that allows companies and wealthy people to kind of avoid paying taxes. You have the cost of climate change, both in terms of extreme weather events, mitigation, and adaptation. The transition to sustainable energy sources. So huge pressures, and a real sense by global South governments in particular of having been completely abandoned by wealthy countries. I mean, I know that many Americans feel that the economy is, they're struggling in the economy, but the United States has emerged from COVID the absolute strongest economy, and by spending its way out of the crisis, whereas most people in this world have experienced the pandemic and its aftermath in a situation of intense austerity. And so there's this extreme anger and sense of betrayal, and at the same time, it really contributes to this wariness around human rights, frankly. And that's something that we're seeing quite a bit, where wealthy countries, when they talk about human rights, tend to focus on issues and I don't mean to diminish the importance of these rights, but things like, political repression, civil society repression, ensuring space for civil society, or discrimination against particular groups, women, LGBT people, right? These are really has been the focus, and often including attaching conditionalities on economic assistance to these types of human rights reforms. And for global South governments, the idea of a human rights economy has become more and more interesting to them, because it's a way of saying this is also a human right. The ability for people to be able to afford food, the ability for us to be able to pay for maintaining education systems, health systems, that's also a human right. And global North countries who have disproportionate control over international financial institutions, for example, are using their power in ways that make it impossible for us to meet those obligations. And so it has actually been something that has really gained traction among global South governments during this time. And then just to add in on the U.S. side, it comes also at a time where in the past few months the United States has withdrawn from a lot of multilateral spaces and cut assistance, which has had a very interesting, complex impact on the space. We can, if it's of interest, we can unpack it a bit more in the Q&A session. I don't want to go on too long, but in some cases, just to give you a few examples of how it's done that. So there's a negotiation now for a UN tax treaty. I was actually in the room when the United States just walked out, or like we're not. I mean, they had, even under Biden, they had opposed the treaty, but under Trump, they were just like, we're not even engaging. The Human Rights Council, they've officially disengaged. So they're already not a member, but they don't even engage in debates, and cutting a lot of U.S. AID assistance programs. The actual amount of funding is unclear that they've cut, but obviously huge impacts on programs crucial for rights. Cutting funding for various UN agencies like the World Health Organization that have a huge implication for rights. So there's an immediate harmful impact of these cuts, a complex impact of the absence from the multilateral spaces where these discussions are happening, but also kind of underscoring a need not to depend on U.S. assistance for example, health programs, right? Like, we look at the catastrophic effect of the end of these programs worth, I mean, it's unclear how much has been cut, 20, 40, $60 billion. But we compare that to, say, for example, the $500 billion that governments are losing through tax abuse. And so it kind of further emphasizes for governments that they need to kind of address the structural impediments to being able to actually fund domestically their own health systems rather than rely on foreign aid.
So turning from this to advocacy, how can we think about how to advocate for a human rights economy? And specifically, if you can share some of the ways in which Human Rights Watch has been so actively involved and a leader in this area.
Sure. I forgot to put up this, by the way, this slide. This comes from a few weeks ago, a Honduras statement to the Human Rights Council endorsing the idea of a human rights economy, just to kind of, as an example of what I was talking about earlier. The way in which, when we started doing this work, especially coming from an organization where we were trained in human rights abuse has to have a victim, a violation, and a perpetrator, right? Like very discrete. We know who we're doing. We know who we're targeting. And they were like, how do you change the global economic system? Right? Like, what do you do? Like, what are we advocating for? And it turns out there's actually a lot of things that you can do and a lot of things you can advocate for. It's literally, limitless, the potential advocacy. But I'll give you some examples of things that we've been prioritizing. So one is analyzing budget allocations and fiscal policies of governments, right? So we just did this analysis in Egypt that showed that in real terms, education spending has decreased by 24% in the past, since 2011, right? So a very clear case of a government cutting education spending. And people don't necessarily realize that in the country, especially since the numbers are going up, right? Because especially in Egypt, there's inflation. But in real terms, it's actually going down. So very simple analysis can actually really be an important way for the public to understand what's happening with the government budget. Another way of another type of research that we do is looking at the impact of IMF conditionalities, which has been the focus of my work in collaboration with a lot of people throughout my organization, and how various conditionalities are putting a lot of pressure on rights. So one example, which intersects with climate, is removing fossil fuel subsidies, which are a huge drain on budgets. They're aggressive, and they are a very big problem from a climate perspective. However, when you remove energy subsidies, prices go up, and that becomes a very serious rights issue. And so how do you reconcile these, and how do you ensure that savings from removing energy subsidies is going to investment in rights through other means, through public services, through Social Security? And this is something that we've, another example of something we've done a lot of work on in Sri Lanka and Pakistan and Jordan and a bunch of countries. And then two kind of bigger picture issues on the international side that I wanted to highlight. One is what I've mentioned already, is this UN treaty that's being negotiated right now on international tax cooperation. It was initiated by the African bloc, and it's an effort to move decision-making on tax from the OECD, which is, of course, controlled by wealthy countries, to the UN, which is a more democratic space, and address issues like profit shifting, illicit financial flows, in order to enable governments to increase their revenues from progressively. And that is a huge opportunity for rights. As I mentioned, there's everybody is up in arms, and rightfully so, over the consequence of cutting U.S. aid, but it is a tiny fraction of what governments lose to tax abuse, including in the United States. I mean, this is not only a problem for developing countries, right? Like, it's essentially a transfer of public wealth to private companies and the wealthiest among us. And it's one of the things that enables this spiraling inequality is the distortions in the tax system. And then the other one, which is, I find really interesting, is developing metrics that move beyond GDP and growth. And so the way in which we measure economic progress now is through aggregate growth, and which requires economies to continually grow, which is, an issue for climate, but also doesn't actually tell you about how resources are distributed within a society. And so the idea is that we need metrics that, and also it doesn't actually incorporate the environmental cost of economic activity. So if you can destroy an entire forest, and that gets added to your GDP without the cost, including the economic cost of losing that forest, being reflected in any economic metric. And so the idea is to develop a much more holistic set of metrics that capture the distribution of resources within a society and the environmental aspect. And we had a huge victory in this regard in this kind of, this just gives you an example of how all these like processes that seem completely useless can actually produce something potentially useful. This thing called the Pact for the Future that the UN Secretary General had, kind of a process that he led last year. And one of the last commitments in this kind of otherwise pretty useless international negotiation was to establish a working group that would report back by next UNGA on recommendations for alternative metrics. And now that working group is established, or in the process of being established, and it allows a kind of UN, it begins a UN mechanism that is, draws from UN statistics, et cetera, for potentially completely changing how we measure economic health and growth and progress. And so that's another thing that we're supporting and really advocating for human rights to be integrated into those metrics. I have a quick video that I actually wanted to play so that you can see a little bit of the IMF work. I'll play just the first 90 seconds of it. It's a longer video, but you can see kind of how we are approaching this.
ඒතාවසේ දේවල් ඔක්කොම ඉහළ යනවා කියලා කරගන්න කිල්ලයක් නැතුව තමයි ඉන්නේ මේ. හිතනවා දැන් ගොඩාක් අන්න වැඩි වුණා කියලා මට.
How would you pay for your expenses if they suddenly increased by 50% in the middle of an economic crisis? For Shanti, that is a reality. She, like many others in Sri Lanka, has been directly affected not only by inflation, but also by conditions attached to an International Monetary Fund bailout. The IMF loan program conditions disproportionately affect people with low incomes worldwide, for example by asking for cuts to public spending that affect them or taxes that increase the costs of basic goods and services. The IMF says they are balancing the impacts of these conditions by requiring governments to invest a minimum in some areas of social spending and by improving social security systems. But this isn't quite working.
All right, you're welcome to go see the rest of the video. It's on YouTube if you like. But I wanted to just kind of give a flavor of how we're sort of bringing these big economic questions into a human rights framework.
That's great. And then the final question is, you've talked about the fact that using a human rights economy framing allows us to approach advocacy and seek change in ways that are not only defensive, but also provide positive visions of alternatives to our current system, especially in this sort of dark time for human rights. So if you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of gets into, I think this is a really important reflection point for the human rights movement. And the methods that we have been using until now, which might have been effective at different times, are not really working anymore. And I think one of the things that doesn't work is this name and shame approach, where we tell you what you're doing wrong. First of all, it's often easy to see what is going wrong and harder to understand how to make it right. But also, it doesn't show people why human rights actually, like what the potential of human rights really is. And I think that by what this idea of a human rights economy does, instead of just showing people how bad, right? Like I have some data on the poly crisis that you can kind of look at it on your own. But like, this is how bad our world is, right? In the past 5 years, the 5 richest men have doubled their wealth, and 5 billion people got poorer. We all know that that's not good, right? But what does it look like? I think people need in their imaginations, what does it look like for things to be better, and how do you get there? And the fact that the human rights framework actually is a path in that direction, it gives something to kind of move toward rather than something to just reject. And I think that that's part of what it draws its power from, particularly at this moment.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that engagement. So as promised, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions and thoughts from all of you. And if you could also start with a brief introduction, your name, your year, and anything else you want to share in terms of your interest in this area, that would be great. Yes, please.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Justin. Thank you for speaking. It's really interesting. The real movement to New York after this. Took a human rights class with Professor Huckerby on international human rights law. It was really interesting. I went to Columbia, studied human rights there in middle school. Yeah, I have a. Well, first, I just want to say I think it's really interesting that you're focusing on tax avoidance, because I feel like that's a conversation that's like often overlooked, specifically not just within human rights, but like when we talk about the economy, because I think exactly those loopholes are like really important. But I have like kind of a high level question. I'm sorry, it's like really basic, but it's kind of on my mind right now when we talk about regulations and human rights economy. It seems to me like, I don't know, maybe because we're in a capitalist society, but like I feel like there's a problem of like immovable force meets unstoppable object, right? And like we can chase corporations to like, we can tax them, we can regulate them, we can prevent them from doing X, Y, Z. But ultimately, if a corporation's sole duty is to provide profit for shareholders, like ultimately that is what they're created for. I don't know, I'm kind of curious, like in your opinion, or from like a human rights economy advocate standpoint, like is that just always going to be the linchpin that like we can do our best to regulate and tax, but ultimately like corporations are solely created not for people and planet in mind. Like that, it's just never going to happen. Like that's not what their duty is. To do so would make it not a corporation. It would hinder development. It would be against their mandate. It's just like against what it's supposed to do. So I'm kind of curious, like, is that just the world we're living in? It's just kind of like cat and mouse, or do we have to reframe like what it means to develop outside of like just creating corporations with shareholders?
Not a basic question at all. Actually, a very interesting question. I also went to Columbia, by the way. Okay, so I'm trying to kind of gather my thoughts. It's actually a very complex question. Firstly, I think that this is why regulations is so important. I think a kind of earlier iteration of the kind of conception of business and human rights very much relied on this idea that we can work with businesses, to responsible businesses, and I think that approach really hit against exactly what you're describing. That ultimately that it's just outside of the DNA of a company to be able to do that, but companies are limited in how they can pursue shareholder profit by law, right? They're not allowed to break the law. And so if we have which is why I think a lot of the business and human rights movement has reoriented itself toward regulation rather than kind of these voluntary principles. And so which is precisely, when you know that the company will find every single loophole in order to increase shareholder profits, then that tells you the intensity with which you need to actually make sure that the legal system is airtight. I mean, I'll give you an example from the current tax debates where, so there's this OECD framework for international tax cooperation, which was a pretty big-ish deal. I mean, there's a lot of caveats around it, that it got to a 15% global minimum corporate tax rate. But that would go to the company. This is the country in which the company is headquartered as a kind of a first priority option. And the tax havens, what they did was they said that what we would do is we would issue like a guarantee that you've met this threshold, we take the money from you, and then return it to you through a some sort of subsidy. But legally, you would meet this minimum threshold, but in practice, you're taking the money back into your pockets. And this is how creative and insistent companies are in kind of in their pursuit of shareholder profits, and that is how intensely the law has to meet it, right? So I don't think it's, of course, we can envision a world in which companies are more restrained. Actually, as a Columbia professor, Katerina Pistor, who does a lot of really interesting work on the kind of the intersection of law and like corporate law and how it kind of facilitates this exact type of, and I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that that's how companies have to operate, right? We can't imagine a world in which companies operate under, a different logic and a different set of priorities. But being that they don't, I think that we have to really, really, really emphasize legal, both enforcement and actual legislation.
Other questions? Alexander.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a 1L here, and sort of a human rights defense background before coming here, but very interested in human rights going forward. And I think the majority of people here at Duke are kind of operating within a U.S.-based system or a U.S.-based paradigm. And I mean, given the political climate of the next 4 years of withdrawal from a lot of international human rights frameworks, I think it's sort of a pressing question to ask, like, what can U.S.-based lawyers do to facilitate the development of a human rights economy, both domestically and abroad, and sort of which front is more effective for creating those outcomes that we would like to see, just given like what we know about the situation, assuming that we can't really change the direction the U.S. government's going to take on these issues with at least the next 4 years.
That's an interesting question. I think the United States needs a lot of internally focused work, actually. And the best use of resources would be to start really building the ground game, doing the groundwork for an understanding of human rights that, first of all, fully understands and digests and absorbs economic, social, and cultural rights. The U.S. government hasn't even ratified the covenant. And also, a truly progressive solidarity vision of what an economy that works for people looks like. And I think that there are elements within the United States that is doing this, but I think really kind of building that out much more, and then setting the groundwork for whatever comes next. And I think actually it can also help compete with a version of politics that does use economic insecurity, and a sense of deep economic unfairness, but in a way that capitalizes on people's lack of understanding of how economies work to actually, in practice, change the economy to even more benefit the wealthy. I mean, we often talk about misinformation in the political sphere, or disinformation, like intentional disinformation. But there is a huge amount of intentional disinformation in the economic sphere where people, moneyed interests essentially, are convincing the public of things that are absurd, right? Like even the idea that governments are, like when you're if you lose your job and you got to tighten your belt, and the government also in a situation of crisis needs to cut spending, like governments are not households. Governments should not be cutting spending we've known that for a long time, right? Actually, governments need to do counter-cyclical spending at a time of crisis. but it's just a way, and it makes sense to people. Like, what do people know about, how economies work, right? So they're like, oh yeah, we should definitely cut stuff, not realizing that this is like just the rich trying to get rid of programs that help people, right? Scaremongering around public health systems, tons and tons of disinformation being, I think, put out there. So I think really kind of building out a vision for what economies look like that support people, that realize the right to health, to education, and using rights language. I mean, it struck me that a few times in some of the presidential debates, there was a kind of, sometimes they're talking about meeting people's needs, like health and education. And sometimes they would actually, like Kamala Harris would actually say meeting people's rights. And it resonates differently. It's not making sure that people have access to healthcare is not charity. It's their right. And that is not something that I think Americans have a conception of, by and large.
Yes.
Jonathan, I'm a 2L. Honestly, I came for lunch, but I got a great deal, so thank you. This question branches almost directly off of the prior question. You've spoken about how politically driven this entire kind of motivation is, but especially in the US context, like you just said, Americans have no understanding, essentially, of how economies work. How do we actually kind of like counteract that? How do we help people in the United States in particular understand that there are benefits to spending, to providing aid across the globe, so that, in the interim, while we try and adjust all these other kind of programs, all these other systems that are broken, we don't have people suffering to a greater extent across the world?
I wish I had the answer to that. I mean, that's one of the things that we are like, it's a real struggle. Like, I mean, part of, I don't think there's one answer. I think it's like, kind of all hands on deck type of response that's needed. And, part of my response is that Human Rights Watch is, to the extent that it has a platform, is to use that in order to do just that. But I think this is something that needs to change in a lot of different parts of society, right? Like how basic economic literacy, how politicians talk about these issues. This is, it's really a pretty serious problem, but the point is we need to try. We need to try by focusing on it, by paying attention to it, by making it matter, and by making it credible, right? Like, it's hard, the way in which it's discussed during election season can feel very opportunistic. And I think it needs to be something that is a priority for progressive movements within the United States always, and not just to win elections. And I do think that there are some really good organizations that are doing that, but not enough.
Other questions? Alex? Mm-hmm.
Again, sorry, I've got a lot of questions. I liked what you said about presenting the vision of what a human rights economy looks like, and particularly in this day and age, I think that's a really vital point to draw on. You mentioned a lot of crises that are around the world, and I think they're foremost in a lot of our minds. One thing that you didn't mention that I would like clarity on is the rise of AI and the increasing digitization of economies, and especially the kind of sudden digitization in the developing world. Like, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guinea, and one of the things that really struck me is there was no electricity or running water, but there was fiber optic being laid down. And there is this kind of exposure to the whole digital sphere of things happening kind of all at once. And so my sort of question is, how does the human rights economy build in economic digital rights, particularly around the ownership of data, the right to privacy, and increasingly the protections against disinformation that things like the rapid rise of Gen AI facilitate?
Yeah, I see the relationship, the intersection with digital to be a little bit different within the human rights economy. And all the stuff that you mentioned are really important. but for at least from my part, like my focus on the human rights economy, like the issues of privacy and data ownership, extremely important. But probably just because within Human Rights Watch, it's different. It's a different division that handles that on a day-to-day basis. From a human rights economy perspective, it's very much related to there's two parts of it, two sides of the coin in many ways. One is technology transfers, and so there's a risk that governments with access to this technology it will either kind of further increase inequalities between countries, and then at the same time that it will also disrupt labor markets. And so, how do you both at the same, how do you deal with this almost sort of contradictory problem where, on the one hand, ensuring fair distribution of equitable distribution of technology, which is part of the right to development, and at the same time, ensuring that people's rights are protected through changes in labor markets, which gets to the point, back to the point, this idea of human rights as like having the potential to envision worlds which don't yet exist. Because you can take something like the invention of AI, and it can lead to extreme inequality and extreme poverty as people lose their job. Or you can take it into a world in which people need to work less, and you actually have a beautiful right, my favorite right, the right to leisure, to rest and leisure, and we can actually shrink our need to be productive all the time and enter a golden age of arts and but we need the default is the former, and it requires actually intentionally building out the structures for the former world to take place, and I think that the human rights framework provides that structure if we choose to use it.
Just to echo that point, there was a project at our clinic took on during the COVID-19 pandemic where we documented examples of positive human rights advances that countries are making during the pandemic. So sort of this example of a crisis situation where actually there was, in some cases temporarily, unfortunately, because a lot of these measures were then rescinded, but a vision and very concrete laws and policies and measures where housing was provided and healthcare was ensured. And so this sort of possibility of alternative, positive human rights advances that can come, it can go either way, but that there were instances where it was actually really positive and required a lot of intentionality. And again, was temporary, which to some extent took away from it at the end of it. But just to sort of echo this point about the possibility for alternative visions that can be really positive.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, the U.S. cut child poverty in half, which is extraordinary.
Yeah. Any other final questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tessa. I'm a sophomore, and I'm taking an intro to human rights class right now, which is what interested me in this event. I was going to say, you talked about sort of actions that like organizations can take in terms of developing a human rights economy. But is there anything you think we can do more as individuals? Are there any economic choices individuals can be making to kind of shift like personal spending towards a more human rights centered economy? If you could just talk on that.
I like that question. I have the like my personal answer, and then I have the kind of movement answer. I think that putting the responsibility on the movement answer is putting the responsibility on individuals doesn't get to the crux of the problem, right? Like, and it's also kind of unfair, right? Like, people are managing a million pressures in their lives at all points, and policy changes can have vast differences in like I said, like I mentioned, during the pandemic, one policy change cut child poverty in half, right? So that's the level of change that is really required to make a difference. The personal answer is that if you can, like I do try to the extent possible, to align my consumption, not perfectly. I'm not, definitely complicit in, global economy catastrophes like any other human on Earth. But there is a way in which, like, if you kind of do need to be the change you want to see, and to really support the types of businesses that are, paying fair wages and et cetera, et cetera. But I think, I personally do that just because it feels nice and it feels good. But I don't think that we should expect that to really, I don't think that that's where the public pressure should be.
Any other final questions? Yes.
During Trump's first term,
Sorry, if you could just introduce yourself briefly, please.
I'm Matt. I'm a 1L. So I know that during Trump's first term, he passed some directive that banned the importation of goods that were used with forced labor from certain countries and certain goods. I'm wondering to what extent that kind of demonstrates that he might be willing to try to enforce some aspect of kind of fair trade, fair creation practices for American consumption, or if that was just something done for political gain back in his first term that isn't something that's going to be repeated.
Is it the China, like the Uyghur China thing? Okay.
I think it was also from the Congo and maybe like Malaysia.
Oh, interesting. Look, I will be honest, that one of the things that I think is interesting about Trump is that he has forced a conversation about economic minutia that no political party wanted to have. And I think he is willing to take huge economic risks and to have, real economic reforms that no political party was willing to do. Unfortunately, I don't think that his vision of economies, of economic change aligns with human rights. But it is more complicated, and here I'm going to tread really carefully. It is more complicated than everything that he does is inherently bad, and therefore we should oppose it. And especially something like tariffs, right? Which are really complicated. The implications are really complicated. People are both workers and consumers. Things can, affect both salaries and prices, right? Like these are very complex questions. And I think that what is really important to do is to kind of approach the attention that economic policy is getting now with a kind of independence of thinking and a freshness of thinking that really, takes seriously the idea that our economies need to fundamentally change to get somewhere where they are not currently, and to show where his proposals don't do that, and to concede where his proposals do that. I haven't personally researched every one of his, so I don't have like I can't tell you which do and which don't. I mean, I will say in general, it appears that he's looking to give massive tax cuts to billionaires for, by cutting programs that are really, really, really important. So it does not appear to be a great change for the most part, but that doesn't mean that there aren't potentially within his not always coherent economic proposals something that could actually be good. And I think it's important not to just sort of reflexively reject anything wholesale because it's coming from his administration.
All right, so we're just about at time. So thank you all for joining us and for the really thoughtful, thought-provoking questions. And huge thanks to our speaker, Sarah Sadoun, for joining us today.